Today, we'll be revisiting what consensus deemed the biggest reaches of the 2019 NFL Draft, and we'll determine who was right on their career projection, the NFL or consensus. There are a few things that you might want to know, such as how I compiled this list, how I scored the competition, and so on and so forth. But if you want to know, I'll put a graphic on screen explaining all of that, so feel free to take the time to read it. Also, quick note. If you saw my community post, you'll know that I recently started a new job that has taken up a lot of my time, so I've been a bit slower to get this video out. Although this video is coming to you a few weeks into the 2024 season, we'll only be grading players based off their career stats before this most recent season. Alright, let's get into it. We start with Washington tight end Drew Sample, who came out of college as a blocking tight end. I know blocking tight ends aren't the most exhilarating position to talk about, but this is one of the biggest reaches against the consensus board in the draft, so I promise you I'll make this quick. In Sample's 5-year college career, he had 46 receptions for 487 yards and 5 touchdowns, with his best season coming in his senior year, where he caught 25 passes for 252 yards and 3 touchdowns. Given that he was a blocking tight end, Sample's projection to the NFL was really based on whether the scout believed he could develop into at least an average pass catcher. Consensus didn't really think so, placing him at 161 overall on the consensus big board, which is a 5th round pick. However, the Bengals saw much more upside, taking Sample number 52 overall in the 2nd round, a reach of 108 spots. As a rookie, Sample found himself as the number 3 tight end behind Tyler Eifert and CJ Uzomah, only playing 106 snaps and running a route on 35 of those snaps, catching 5 passes for 30 yards. The next season, with Uzomah injured and Eifert off the team, he'd play 848 snaps, running a route on 413 of them, catching 40 passes for 349 yards and 1 touchdown. That season, on his 341 run blocking snaps, he'd earn a PFF grade of 71.1, which was 6th in the NFL of 46 qualifying tight ends. But the next season, the Bengals seemed to end the experiment to make him a pass catcher, having him run block on 285 snaps, giving him 2 times more blocking snaps than his 114 snaps running a route. On his routes that he did run, he had 11 catches for 81 yards, no touchdown, and a 47.2 PFF receiving grade. On his blocking snaps, he had a 62.9 run blocking grade, 33rd in the NFL of 85 qualifying tight ends. The next season, he'd go down with a season-ending injury in Week 2, leading us to 2023, where he played about 500 snaps, running a route on 190 of them, catching 22 passes for 163 yards and 2 touchdowns, while run blocking on 217 of them, earning a 61.5 PFF run block grade, which was 18th in the NFL of 91 qualifying tight ends. At the end of the 2023 season, Sample signed a 3-year, $10.5 million contract with the Bengals, giving him the 30th APY for NFL tight ends. Admittedly, much of a blocking tight end's impact is not felt in the stat sheet, but for a 2nd rounder, you want them to either, at minimum, be one of the following. A rotational player who is really great at one thing, or B, good enough to stay on the field as a consistent starter, even if they are not great at one particular thing. Sample isn't really either. He's definitely not a well-rounded starter because he just isn't really a great pass catcher, giving him a ceiling as a rotational starter. When he does play, he's a good blocker, maybe in between the 10th to 15th best blocking tight end in the NFL right now, but I wouldn't say that he's so good at blocking that he's worth the 52nd overall pick in the draft. He's definitely a useful player in Cincinnati's offense to help their run game, but he's just not worth that high of a pick. Therefore, consensus gets the first point of the video. Next is linebacker Jawan Taylor, who during his 4 years at Hawaii racked up 41 TFLs, 17.5 sacks, 2 interceptions, and 390 total tackles. Despite that production, Taylor was ranked by consensus as the 139th player overall, a 5th round pick. But in the NFL draft, he was selected by the Detroit Lions just into the 2nd round, at 43 overall, a consensus reach of 96 total spots. Taylor had a solid rookie season, playing just below 600 snaps. He had 58 tackles, 2 sacks, 1 forced fumble, 19 stops, and 1 interception. His play resulted in him finishing with the 27th highest PFF grade of 59 qualifying linebackers, barely putting him into the top half of the league. The next season, the Lions would raise his snap count to 624, but instead of getting better, Taylor would get worse. He'd again have 58 tackles, now paired with 2 TFLs, 17 stops, and 2 forced fumbles. In coverage, Taylor allowed an 87.5% completion percentage against him, which was the 4th highest in the league. He gave up 11.5 yards per reception, which was the 7th worst for linebackers, and quarterbacks had a 140 passer rating when targeting him, the highest passer rating allowed by any linebacker that season. He wasn't any better in run defense either, as his 36.5 PFF run D grade placed him at 49th in the league, and his 10% missed tackle rate was in the top half of the NFL. Coming off a poor second season and having a new coaching staff take over the team, Tavai's job security was hanging by a thread going into 2021, and that thread was ultimately cut, as the Lions would release him before the start of the season. 2021 was basically a wash for him, as he'd signed to the Patriots practice squad in September, and he'd be promoted to the active roster in October, playing only 57 snaps over the course of 13 games for the Pats. But when it looked like all hope was lost, Tavai had a bounce-back season in New England. Despite starting the season as the backup linebacker, Tavai took over the starting job in Week 5 and would play in all 17 games for the Pats, racking up 69 tackles, nice, 2 tackles for loss, 1.5 sacks, 2 pass deflections, and 20 defensive stops. Tavai wouldn't miss a single tackle that entire season and was excellent in coverage, allowing the 20th lowest completion percentage of 93 qualifying linebackers and earning the 17th best PFF coverage grade. This led to Tavai signing a 2-year, $4.4 million extension with the Pats to be their starter, and boy did that work out for New England, because he had an elite season in 2023, playing 838 snaps, getting 110 tackles, 5 TFLs, 1 sack, 2 forced fumbles, 5 pass deflections, 2 interceptions, and 35 defensive stops. His 86.6 defensive grade was 3rd in the league, 86.2 run grade was 6th in the league, 82.7 coverage grade was 7th in the league, and his 74.2 passer rating when targeted was the lowest allowed of all linebackers. Jawan Taylor had finally arrived. And so had some new money, as the Patriots gave him an extension early, signing him to a new deal this past July of 3 years, $16 million, which paid him as the 33rd highest APY for linebackers. But despite an excellent season in 2023, when scoring these players, we have to look at the totality of their career up to this point. Tavai had an average first season, an extremely poor second season, and a non-existent third season. Perhaps Tavai got the short end of the stick, being picked by a regime on the way out and being cut by a new regime who didn't have the same vision for him or the patience to see if he'd bounce back from a poor second season, but the Lions were justified in cutting him based on his play up to that point. Since getting back onto the field, Tavai has had 1 good season and 1 excellent season, essentially running the gambit of possible outcomes a player could have any given year. You see where this is going. For now, the point goes to consensus, because I just can't say that his whole career at this point has been worthy of spending a second-round pick on, and there's no guarantee that he'll continue his excellent level of play, which is why he's paid like the 33rd best linebacker in the NFL, instead of a top 10 one like he played in 2023. In the same way that the Patriots are being patient with his contract, we too will be patient and say that we need a little bit more consistency before we can call him worthy of a second-round value. But no worries, Pats fans. Another revisit to this in a year or two will likely do him well if he keeps up this level of play, which it seems like he's primed to do. But now, we'll move to our first big buoy of the video, Alabama State offensive tackle Tytus Howard, a high school quarterback and tight end in his first year of college, who switched to offensive line and developed into such a good right tackle in college that he was named first team all-conference. Going into the draft, he was ranked by consensus as the 96th overall player, a third-round value. But in the draft, he'd be taken in the first round, 23rd overall by the Houston Texans, making him a consensus reach of 73 spots. In his first 2 seasons, Howard would play in 22 games of a possible 32, being placed on IR at the back end of both of his first 2 seasons. Despite missing 10 games, he'd play almost 1,300 snaps in that time frame and started in every game that he played. He didn't play horribly, but he found himself ranking slightly below average in most categories after his first 2 seasons, where he had an average rank of 54 in pass blocking, 50th in run blocking efficiency, and 43rd in run blocking. In his second season, where he played 14 games, his 42 pressures allowed were the 6th most in the NFL, and his 11 penalties were tied for the most in the league. In 2021, he'd kick into guard, where he'd play 15 games, grading out as the worst run blocker in the league, but as the 21st best pass blocker. In 2022, the Texans would pick up Howard's 5th-year option and move him back to right tackle, where he'd continue to hover around league average, ranking out as the 33rd best run blocker, the 37th best pass blocker, and allowing the 18th most pressures in the league. With that performance, the Texans would sign Howard to a 3-year, $56 million deal, making him the 13th highest paid offensive tackle in the league. But unfortunately, that investment has not worked out for them so far. In 2023, Howard was placed on IR twice, first with a hand injury, then a knee injury, only managing to play 408 snaps in 7 games. In those games, he'd grade out as the 70th run blocker in the league and the 78th best pass blocker, playing at left guard rather than his natural position at tackle. Going into 2024, Howard is now slated to move back to right tackle yet again and will be their starter. Similar to the Jawan Taylor verdict I reached on the last video, I think this might be a controversial decision because I believe consensus was right on Howard's value. Although he's paid like a top 15 tackle in the NFL, he just hasn't ever played like it, and he's consistently been a league average or in the bottom half of the league in run blocking grade, pass blocking grade, and pass blocking efficiency, while struggling to stay healthy, being placed on season-ending IR 3 times in 5 seasons, while also completing another IR stint and missing time. The only time that he's finished top 15 in any statistic is when he finished in the top 15 in penalties 2 out of his 4 years where he's played half the season or more, and when he finished 6th for most pressures allowed in 2020. Although his versatility helps, the justification for his poor play at offensive guard last season was that offensive guard is not his natural position, so it raises questions as to whether he really even is that versatile. Howard has no doubt been a useful piece for the Texans, providing a baseline of solid yet not great play for them since signing, which is valuable to the team, especially at offensive line, but not what you look for in a first-round pick. It's really more akin to a late second to third rounder. Howard can 100% bounce back after having a rough 2023, and I really hope he does, but at this point, I don't think he'd be someone that would be selected in the first round if this draft were done over again. Therefore, we award this point to consensus. With consensus starting to run away, maybe the NFL can turn to a safety to prevent them breaking off a big run. So let's talk about Marquise Blair out of Utah, a player praised by scouts for his athleticism, aggressive play style, and coverage ability, which he used to earn himself a spot on the All-Pac-12 second team in his final season with the Utes. But despite the positives, many scouts were also concerned with his ability to stay on the field, as he'd previously suffered a season-ending injury in college, had a very slender frame, and had been ejected 3 times in 2 college football seasons for targeting. With those concerns, consensus placed Blair at 108 on the consensus big board, a 4th-round pick. But in the draft, he'd go shortly after the first round, at 47 overall when he was taken by the Seattle Seahawks, a reach of 61 picks in the eyes of consensus. In his rookie season, Blair hardly saw the field, but not for the reasons consensus was worried about. He simply wasn't able to make his way into the starting rotation, spending the year as a backup safety and special teams player, playing in 14 games and totaling 230 snaps. Although it was a small sample size, he played fairly well in those snaps, getting 32 tackles, 2 forced fumbles, 1 PBU, 5 defensive stops, and earning an 80.8 coverage grade and a 78.5 defensive grade. But Blair was on the right track, as the next year he'd move to nickel cornerback and be named the starter in camp. However, in week 2, after Quandre Diggs was ejected for a helmet-to-helmet hit, Blair would step in at free safety to replace him, and only a few plays later, he'd tear his ACL, taking Blair out for the rest of the season, having played only 63 snaps. The next year, Blair would move back to free safety, backing up Quandre Diggs, and he'd play 119 snaps before injuring his knee in week 7, resulting in being placed on season-ending IR for the 2nd straight year. Since that point, Blair's been signed and waived by multiple teams, playing on special teams for the Panthers in 2022, and not playing a single snap in 2023. After being released by the Birds in April, he re-signed with a different bird, the Seahawks again, in July, to compete for a roster spot, but he was ultimately cut and re-signed to the practice squad only a few days ago at the time of writing. In the same way the NFL won many points of the consensus draft steals because the players couldn't stay healthy, the same applies here to give consensus the point. Blair showed promise going into his 2nd season, being named the starter, but there's no dispute that his production up to this point is simply not worth a 2nd-round pick, given the fact that he's played 412 defensive snaps in his first 3 seasons and has not played a defensive snap since 2021. Not much more explanation is needed. Point consensus. In our attempt to see if the NFL can get any points, we'll now go to the next largest consensus reach, UCF defensive lineman Tristan Hill, a player who flashed high-level play in college, but had concerns due to a perceived lack of effort when he was playing and some alleged character concerns. Hill supposedly found himself in the doghouse of multiple UCF coaches, resulting in him only starting 1 game in his final season, despite having an excellent year when he was on the field and having previously been a starter before that season, which led to him publicly complaining about his playing time. Despite not being a starter and the reported character concerns, the Cowboys drafted Hill in the 2nd at number 58 overall, which was a 60-pick reach according to consensus, who ranked Hill at 118, a 4th-round pick. Hill's rookie season was uneventful, playing in 7 games, but not starting any. Hill was mysteriously declared inactive in 9 of the team's games that season, and only played in 3 games after week 7. In the 7 games he played, he'd get on the field for 121 snaps, getting 5 tackles and 3 stops. But despite being inactive the majority of his rookie season, he'd be named the Cowboys starter at 3-tech defensive tackle for 2020. In the first 5 games of that season, he'd play 212 snaps, making 11 tackles and 7 defensive stops. However, during that 5th game, he'd tear his ACL, and he would be placed on season-ending IR. In 21, Hill would miss a lot of time after starting the season on the PUP list, finally getting on the field in November. In his very limited time, he'd get suspended for 1 game after punching a Raiders player in the face, he'd miss 2 games from COVID, and he would be relegated to a backup role behind Osa Odigizua. In the 6 games he did manage to play, his production was much of the same: 171 snaps, 11 tackles, half a sack, and 6 defensive stops. In 2022, it was more of the same. Backing up Odigizua for half the season, he'd play 229 snaps and get 12 tackles, 1 sack, and 11 stops. But he was only backup for half the season because in November, Hill was released by the Cowboys and signed by the Cardinals, where he'd play until late December, where he suffered a season-ending injury. Hill went into 2023 on the Browns practice squad, and he was released in September. A week later, he was signed to New England, where he'd play 1 game and register no stats. In August of 2024, Hill was just signed to the Patriots practice squad, bringing us to current day. I don't really think that we need to go into the reasoning for this one because it's pretty clear why the NFL won't be getting its first point here. Hill has barely played, and when he did play, he didn't really have much of an impact. He was often injured and has spent time with 3 different teams since being released by the Cowboys mid-season in 2022. None of those teams really felt that he was good enough to keep him on the active roster, or even to keep him on the practice squad besides the Patriots, which is where he finds himself today on his 4th team, having never played over 230 snaps in a season, and having never started more than 5 games in a season. Therefore, we award another point to consensus. But if you know the next name, you know this is not getting any better for the NFL. We're talking about defensive lineman LJ Collier from TCU, who was ranked by consensus at 87 overall, a 3rd-round value. Collier was picked in the 2019 NFL Draft at 29 overall in the 1st round, which was a reach of 58 spots. Many people were skeptical of this pick, and it was widely considered a reach. Unfortunately, Collier's rookie season did nothing to change that, as he'd play in 11 games, starting none of them, and only played 152 snaps, where he barely made an impact, getting 3 tackles and 2 defensive stops, while also missing 2 tackles. But despite the slow start, Collier would be named a starter in his 2nd season. Playing in all 16 games, Collier would get 559 snaps, making 22 tackles, 2 pass deflections, 3 sacks, 4 TFLs, 14 defensive stops, and he had 21 pressures on a pass rush win rate of 6.6%, which was 75th in the league of 126 qualifying defensive linemen. Collier would end that season with a 57.6 run D grade, 47th in the league of 70 qualifiers, and a 61 pass rushing grade, 46th in the league of 70. It was far from amazing, but it wasn't horrible. But I guess the Seahawks decided that that one season was enough, as in 2021, Collier would find himself coming off the bench yet again, totaling 219 snaps in 10 games without starting a single one. He'd grade out much worse that season, as his 47.1 defensive grade would rank 117th in the NFL, and he'd only manage 8 tackles and 1 TFL. Going into 2022, Seattle declined his 5th-year option, and Collier was placed on IR, not getting on the field until October. He'd play 149 snaps in 8 games, somehow managing to be an even worse run defender with a 35.7 grade and only managing 7 tackles. Once free agency arrived, Seattle would let him walk, and he'd find a new home in Arizona, and he'd also be signed to the Cardinals after he found his new home. However, after his first game where he played 37 snaps and graded in the 40s in both run defense and pass rush, Collier would injure his bicep, resulting in being placed on season-ending IR after only 1 game. Just recently, Collier re-signed with Arizona to a 1-year, $1.3 million deal, and it appears that he survived roster cuts, being listed as a backup on the team's website and ESPN.com. This pick is dubbed as one of the worst picks in the John Schneider era by many Seahawks fans, and it's unfortunately for good reason. Collier has barely played, and when he has played, he's struggled to make an impact. He's difficult to keep on the field for his pass rushing upside because he's such an awful run defender, but at the same time, he never hit that pass rushing upside that he had. In his only season where he played enough snaps to be ranked, his pass rush win rate was 75th in the league, and his PFF pass rush grade was 74th. Despite being on the team for 4 years and starting 1 season, he wasn't able to convince the team that he was an every down starter, and now he finds himself as a backup making league minimum money only 5 years into his career. I'm wishing him the best of luck, because I don't want to root for any player to fail, but when you just look at his career objectively, it's clear that he wasn't worth a 1st-round pick. Consensus adds another point to their dominant lead. Before we get to some of the bigger names, let's do 2 quick hitters. These guys were significant reaches, but I don't want this video to be forever, so I'll quickly explain the results in about a minute for each. Northern Illinois offensive tackle Max Scharping was viewed by consensus as the 113th best player in the draft, but taken at 55 overall by the Texans, a 58-pick reach. In his first 3 seasons, he'd play in 48 games, starting 33 of them. After those 3 seasons, in which he'd grade out as a very poor run blocker, but an average pass blocker, he was waived by Houston going into 2022. Scharping would sign with Cincinnati for the 2022 postseason due to an injury to Alex Kappa, and he struggled heavily. Regardless, the Bengals would bring him back for 2023, where he played 13 snaps. Scharping signed with the Eagles as a backup offensive lineman for the 2024 season, but he was released at the end of August. Given that he's played 43 regular season snaps in the past 2 seasons and hasn't capitalized on any opportunity to retain or take a starting job, we'll give this point to consensus. He's a solid backup, a fringe second stringer, who you'd rather have as a third stringer, but he's not worth a second round pick. Another TCU edge rusher, Ben Banogu, makes this list. Banogu was ranked as the 98th best player on the consensus big board, but was taken at 49 overall by the Colts, a consensus reach of 49 picks. Also, is it Banogu or Bonagu? I don't know, I'll just keep switching it up. Bonagu's career high in snaps was in his rookie year, where he played 272 snaps, but started no games. He'd grid out poorly with a defensive grade below 50 and only 11 tackles, 3 TFLs, and 17 pressures. Over the next 3 years, he'd barely play for the Colts, totaling 284 snaps across the 3 seasons. In those snaps, he'd managed 12 pressures and 18 tackles, while grading out as a below-average defender in all phases of the game. Because of this, the Colts let Banogu walk as a free agent, and he'd signed with Dallas in June of 2023, but he was released only 2 months later. Bonagu is now out of the league entirely, having only recorded 2.5 sacks in 50 NFL games. Banogu never played more than 275 snaps in a season, has never been named a starter for a game, all of his sacks came in his rookie season, and he's been out of football for a year after failing to make the Cowboys roster as a free agent on league minimum money. Yet another point for consensus. With our quick hitters done, let's now get back to our feature players, starting with Central Michigan cornerback Sean Murphy-Bunting, ranked as the 76th best player in the draft by consensus, but drafted at number 39 overall by the Buccaneers, a 37-pick reach. Murphy-Bunting's first 3 years were filled with both highs and lows. He'd play in 41 games, starting 31 of them, and would earn a spot on the PFWA All-Rookie team in his first season, and in his second season, he'd become the first player with an interception in each of his first 3 career playoff games since Ed Reed. He'd also catch 4 regular season interceptions, break up 14 passes, and make 157 total tackles over that span. But there were some struggles in coverage. He'd allowed 152 of 209 targets against him to be caught, a completion percentage of 72%. His worst performance came in his second season, where his 78.3 completion percentage against was the 4th highest allowed in the NFL, and his 126.1 passer rating when targeted was the 5th highest. He'd take a step up in 2021 though, only allowing 66% of the passes against him to be complete, but he'd have the 26th highest passer rating allowed out of 137 qualifiers, and he'd injure his shoulder, causing him to miss much of the season. I think you see what I mean by highs and lows. Some accolades and good stretches of play, alongside some very poor stretches of play and missed time due to an injury. But in the midst of all of that, he was no doubt getting better. This all came to a head in his contract year, 2022, where he'd have his best season yet. Playing in 12 games, Murphy-Bunting would have 2 interceptions, 7 PBUs, 1 forced fumble, 7 defensive stops, and a PFF coverage grade of 80.9, which was 9th in the NFL out of 90 qualifiers. His 55% completion percentage against was also 25th best in the league, and he allowed a passer rating against him of 78.2, and only gave up 171 yards total in coverage on his 430 snaps. After the best year of his career, he'd walk in free agency, signing a confusingly low deal of 1 year, $3.5 million with the Titans to be their starting cornerback. In 14 games, he'd play 840 snaps, again having some highs and lows by pairing 2 interceptions, 8 PBUs, 2 forced fumbles, and 13 defensive stops, with a 54.4 coverage grade, 70th in the NFL, 10 penalties, and 628 yards allowed, which was in the top half of the league. With his volatility, advanced metrics would ultimately place him at the level of a league average corner, as his 10.7 snaps per reception was 47th of 83, his 65.2 completion percentage allowed was 35th of 83, and his 91.9 passer rating allowed was 42nd of 83. After 1 year with Tennessee, Murphy-Bunting signed a 3-year, $25.5 million deal with Arizona, an APY of $8.5 million, the 23rd highest amongst cornerbacks. I have no idea who to award this point to. Cornerback is a very volatile position, and Murphy is obliged by being just as volatile as a player. Some seasons he's been one of the worst cornerbacks in the league at allowing completions and in coverage grade, but other years he's been above average or even top 10. In general, I think you'd want a second round pick to have a bit of a higher floor, but cornerback is the most volatile position in the league, so it's fair to give Murphy-Bunting some leeway when looking at whether he'd have the floor of a second rounder. He hasn't spent much time injured, he showed the potential to give quality play, and is now a full-time starter being paid like a top 23 cornerback in the NFL, which in a vacuum is a player most teams would be happy with drafting in the second round. Although it's close, I'm leaning towards the NFL on this one, so I'll award them the point. But let me know what you think below. With the NFL's first point finally on the board, we'll transition to Washington offensive tackle Kaleb McGary, who is ranked by consensus as a third rounder, number 68 overall, but he was taken by the Atlanta Falcons in the first round at 31 overall, a reach of 37 spots. For the first 2 years of his career, consensus looked like they were easily right on this pick. McGary did earn the starting role, starting 30 games in the first 2 seasons, but he struggled heavily. As a pass protector, McGary allowed 13 sacks in his rookie season, the most in the NFL. His 49 pressures allowed were the third most, and his 52.8 pass blocking grade was 58th of 61 qualifiers. His second season wasn't much better, as he'd allowed 30 pressures on 200 less pass blocking snaps, and his 58.5 pass block grade was 51st of 59. But in those 2 seasons, he wasn't a particularly good run blocker either, ranking 48th of 61 in his rookie season and 32 of 59 in his second season. In 2021, it was more of the same from a pass blocking standpoint. McGary's 50.6 pass blocking grade was 53rd of 57, his 9 sacks allowed were second most, and his 41 pressures were 11th most. But he did improve as a run blocker, ranking 22nd of 57 tackles. Although he started for 3 straight seasons and was slated to be the starter in 2022, Atlanta would decline McGary's 5th-year option, making him a free agent at the end of the year. Bargaining for a new contract, McGary would have his best year in 2022, playing all 17 games and only allowing 19 pressures on 517 pass blocking snaps, giving him the 17th best efficiency rating in the league. Alongside improving as a pass blocker, he finally hit his upside for what he's most known for, as his 91.6 run block grade would rank him second in the NFL. With 3 poor years of play and 1 arguably elite year, Atlanta would split the difference, signing McGary to a 3-year, $34.5 million deal, giving him an APY of $11.5 million, which put him as the 29th highest paid tackle in the NFL. McGary would drastically outperform that contract in 2023, allowing only 17 pressures, the second lowest in the NFL, earning an efficiency rating of 97.7, the 5th best in the NFL, and finishing in the top 10 in run blocking grade. That brings us to present day, where McGary is still on the same contract and he's slated to open the season as Atlanta's starting tackle. Along with Murphy-Bunting, this is also an extremely difficult one. McGary is widely considered one of the best run blocking tackles in the NFL at this point, but he is considered only an average to slightly above average pass protector. He struggled heavily his first 2 seasons and only just recently hit his stride, but it looks like he's here to stay as one of the top 30 tackles in the NFL. His early career struggles kind of make him similar to Jawan Taylor, who we counted as being a loss for the NFL at this point, but I guess the difference between McGary and Taylor is that even when McGary was struggling, he was a consistent starter and had a good baseline of play at one aspect of his position, run blocking. Whereas Taylor struggled so badly in his first 2 seasons that he not only didn't start, but he was cut, resulting in him losing a whole year of playing time. This essentially makes Taylor's first 3 seasons a massive anchor to find that he's worth his draft spot at this point in time. In trying to stay consistent with my previous rulings, I do think it's a really close call whether the totality of McGary's career is worth a late first rounder at this point, but I kind of think that there's enough to distinguish McGary from Taylor in terms of playing time, baseline level of play, and APY at their position to find that McGary might be worth this pick. Probably closer to a second rounder given his pedigree as being one of the best run blocking tackles in the NFL right now, but I think it's still really close. Because the NFL is down so much, let's just give them the point, but I'd love to know what you guys think. And with 2 points in a row for the NFL, we turn to a point in this video which I can only imagine will invoke an entirely rational and level-headed discussion. We're talking about one of the most polarizing quarterbacks in the National Football League, Daniel Jones. Coming out of Duke, Danny Dimes was ranked as the 30th player on the consensus big board, but the Giants shocked the world by taking him at number 6 overall, a 24-pick reach by the consensus board. We're going all out for this one. We're going to be looking at a ton more metrics than we typically look at for every other player, so let's just hop right in, shall we? In his rookie season, Jones would play in 13 games, starting 12 of them, completing 284 of his 459 pass attempts for 3,027 yards and 24 touchdowns against 12 interceptions. This was objectively a very good start, as although the Giants were only able to manage a 3-9 record with Jones as the starter, his 2-to-1 touchdown to interception ratio was pretty solid, his passer rating of 87.7 ranked 17th, putting him right at league average. He ranked 13th in completion percentage over expected, his 72.3% adjusted completion percentage was 21st in the NFL, and his 22.4 tight window percentage was 2nd in the NFL. Not bad for a rookie, but there was some cause for concern. Jones's 18 fumbles were 1st in the NFL, his on-target percentage of 71.7% and his negative 44.9 EPA were both 29th in the NFL, his negative 19.2 DVOA was 30th in the league, he had the 11th highest time to throw, and he had 31 turnover-worthy plays, which was 4th in the NFL, despite not having played a quarter of the season. But he was a rookie. No one was expecting him to play perfectly. He had generally played pretty well, and he did what he needed to do. In 2020, he completed 280 of his 448 passes for 2,943 yards and 11 touchdowns to 10 interceptions in 14 games, one more game than he had played in the prior season. He had improved in some areas, but regressed in others. On the positive side, he only had 11 fumbles, he dropped his time to throw to about league average, and he'd throw 24 big-time throws against only 17 turnover-worthy plays. But despite these improvements, many advanced metrics would paint 2020 as a worst year for Daniel Jones. His negative 22.4 DVOA ranked him 32nd in the NFL, his negative 43.9 EPA ranked him 29th, his 74.8 adjusted completion percentage was 23rd, his 75.2 on-target percentage was 27th, his completion percentage over expected dropped to 19th in the league, his tight window percentage dropped to 10th, he only threw the ball deep on 8.7% of his throws, which was the 27th mark in the NFL, his 7.7 air yards per attempt was 23rd, and his 21.6 pressure to sack conversion rate was the 5th highest in the league. That 2020 season would start to mark a trend for Daniel Jones. He'd start to become a significantly more conservative quarterback, passing up deep opportunities in favor of taking the easier throws underneath. 2021, he'd lean even more into this playstyle, dropping his average depth of target to a career low 7.3, 36th in the NFL, throwing deep on only 6.1% of his attempts, 31st in the NFL, averaging 7.2 air yards per attempt, 27th in the NFL, and only making 7 big-time throws against 12 turnover-worthy plays. But this style of play resulted in his highest completion percentage yet, slightly over 64%, but only 2,400 yards in his 11 games, and 10 touchdowns to 7 interceptions. He'd finished that season with his best EPA, a negative 36.3, which ranked him 22nd in the league, and his best adjusted completion percentage finish, ranking at 19th. However, he'd go 4-7 in starts, would have a negative 10.6 DVOA, ranking him 26th in the NFL, and he suffered a neck injury in Week 12 that would cause him to miss the rest of the season. The next season, Brian Daboll would become his head coach, and, with his help, Jones would lean even further into this conservative playstyle. Jones would throw for only 200 yards a game, a career low, finishing 25th in the league, while having the 14th most pass attempts. His 6.3 air yards per attempt was 33rd in the NFL, his 13.8 tight window percentage was 23rd, he had the second lowest big-time throw percentage, was 24th in yards per attempt, threw the ball under 10 yards on 65% of his passes, had a 6.4 average depth of target, last in the NFL, had the 12th most passing yards gained from yards after the catch, threw 1 touchdown against 5 interceptions when throwing to the middle of the field, ran the 3rd most play-action plays and the 7th most RPOs, and only threw the ball over 15 yards on 4.4% of his passing attempts, which was 33rd in the NFL. But this ultra-conservative playstyle did work. Jones would finish with the 5th highest completion percentage, the lowest interception percentage, 15 touchdowns to 5 interceptions, a 17.5 EPA, placing him 10th in the league, the 7th highest QBR, the 13th highest passer rating, the 20th highest DVOA, and he had 708 rushing yards, which is almost double his career high. This doesn't even include the fact that he'd lead the Giants to a 9-6-1 record and a playoff win over the Vikings, who finished the season 13-4 on the back of 11 wins in one-score games. At the end of the season, the Giants would sign Jones to a 4-year, $160 million contract, giving Jones an average per year of $40 million. This was the 11th highest APY for quarterbacks at the time it was signed and is currently the 14th highest in the NFL. But there was and still is a lot of debate about whether he was worth this money, which is why Jones remains so polarizing to this day. Excellent film analysts like Brett Kollmann pointed out that, despite the Giants' success, Jones's ultra-conservative playstyle resulted in him turning down easy plays for big gains, sacrificing their ability to play up to higher levels of competition. Even without watching film, many argued that it was obvious from watching the games that Jones wasn't really elevating the team, he was just running the offense as designed. This is not inherently a bad thing, but many were concerned by the fact that Jones's $40 million yearly hit would eat up 20% of the Giants' cap space, hurting their ability to actually build the team around him, resulting in them probably losing Saquon Barkley. On the opposing side, Giants fans argued that Jones had elevated the offense, pointing to the lack of talent on the offensive line and skill positions. Unfortunately, we didn't get any clarity at all on this debate in 2023. Jones would play in 6 games, completing 108 of his 160 pass attempts for 909 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 6 interceptions. In this short sample size, his 6.9 average depth of target was 39th in the NFL, and 71% of his pass attempts would be less than 10 yards. But what was different about this year is that even in the short sample size, it became obvious that Jones was still just as conservative in making decisions passing the ball, but was still turning over the ball, essentially negating the whole beneficial part of the game manager type playstyle. After going out with an injury, Tommy Cutlets and Tyrod Taylor would run the offense, looking about the same if not better while doing so, while also making significantly less money. This leads us to where we are today, where Jones is slated to start once again for the Giants in 2024. I'm writing this before the start of the season, and I anticipate this video will come out after the first game or two has been played, so maybe he'll prove me wrong on this point, but for me this is kind of an easy decision, one that I think is backed up by just about every metric we've looked at. Daniel Jones was not worth the 6th overall pick. He's consistently finished in the bottom of the league in EPA, DVOA, and yards per game, while gradually lowering the amount of difficult throws he attempts each season to the intermediate and deep portions of the field, but somehow still turning over the ball just as much. Football is a game of inches, and by turning down these plays, he's just inherently not giving his team the yards that they actually have schemed up. And for a top 10 pick, you expect them to add yards over what you expect instead of taking away yards from what you expect. That's not to say that Daniel Jones is a terrible quarterback, or that he can't be one of the top 32 quarterbacks in the league, or that he's not even an average quarterback right now. I'm just saying for a top 6 pick, you expect them to be a top 5 quarterback. Now that doesn't happen often, but that's what you expect when you take that pick. Yes, he did have that one season where he led the Giants to a playoff win after a 9-6-1 season. So what? Mark Sanchez led the Jets to 2 AFC championship games. Is he worth a top 10 pick? No. Although I genuinely respect him as a person, and I really do hope he proves me wrong, I just don't think any stat backs up a finding that he was a top 6 player in this draft class, as in every meaningful quarterback statistic, he constantly hovers around the 15th to 32nd best quarterback in the NFL. This doesn't mean he can't be a starter or that he's the worst quarterback in the world. It simply just means that he wasn't worth the 6th overall pick, and he's definitely not worth getting paid like a top 10 to 12 quarterback. I know Giants fans are probably going to be mad at me, they might unsubscribe, and they really don't want to hear it. But to them, I ask that we just respectfully disagree, because I just can't lie. I'm going to tell you exactly what I think. I think that's the purpose of this channel. And this is what I think. I'm very open to eating my words though. DJ seems like a very genuine guy that is easy to root for, but I'm just going off objective metrics, my assessment of his film, and quite frankly, the results in terms of making an impact on the Giants' ability to win. At this point, none of those things really make me believe he was worth a top 10 pick, therefore I give consensus the point, but if you want to argue, let's argue in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you guys think. But with Giants fans angry at me, I'm now ready to lighten the mood, so let's talk about Boston College guard Chris Lindstrom, who is ranked on the consensus board at number 35 overall, a 2nd round pick, but he was taken by the Falcons at number 14 overall. If you've heard Lindstrom's name, you already know the NFL was right on this pick, and if you didn't, you're about to find out. Although Lindstrom missed much of his rookie season with a broken foot, he's since started 66 games for the Falcons and has been one of the NFL's best guards. Lindstrom has finished in the top 10 in run blocking grade 3 times, including one finish as the top graded run blocker in the NFL in 2022. Although he started out as an average pass blocker, Lindstrom has now finished 6th 2 seasons in a row in pass blocking grade, and has finished in the top 10 in pass blocking efficiency rating both years. Lindstrom has made the Pro Bowl twice, has been named a second-team All-Pro 2 years in a row, and was signed to a 5-year, $103 million contract, making him the 2nd highest paid guard in the NFL, and the 9th highest paid offensive lineman in general. What else could you want? Outside of his first season, he's been durable, he's a multi-time Pro Bowler, multi-time All-Pro, he's getting paid like one of the best players at his position, and he's consistently grading out as one of the best players at his position in both phases of the game. Therefore, we give this point to the NFL. Lastly, we finish with a player who is perhaps not a huge reach from the consensus board, but was a shocking pick to many on draft night. Clemson edge Clelin Ferrell, who ranked 15 on the consensus big board, but was taken number 4 overall by the Raiders, an 11-pick reach. Ferrell would start in his first 2 seasons as a Raider, playing 26 games and over 1,000 total snaps. Over those 2 seasons, he managed 65 tackles, 11 TFLs, 6.5 sacks, 2 forced fumbles, 7 pass deflections, 40 defensive stops, and 56 pressures, while averaging around a 70 PFF grade. But going into 2021, the Raiders began playing him in preseason games. signaling that he would no longer be starting. They went a step further than that though, actually making Ferrell a healthy scratch for week 1 of the 2021 season. He'd play in the other 16 games sparingly, getting slightly over 250 snaps, but not really doing too much with them, as he'd get 14 tackles, 1.5 sacks, 6 stops, and 17 pressures. The next season, despite the Raiders having declined his 5th-year option, he'd see a slight increase in playing time, playing 492 snaps. He'd have similar results, getting 26 tackles, 3 TFLs, 2 sacks, 2 pass deflections, 11 stops, and 23 pressures. At the end of 2022, the Raiders let him walk, and he'd go on to play for the 49ers, playing almost the exact same amount of snaps and improving slightly with 28 tackles, 6 TFLs, 3.5 sacks, 17 stops, and 30 pressures. After 2023, he'd sign a 1-year, $3.75 million deal with the Commanders, which is where he finds himself today. Although Ferrell is widely considered a huge draft bust, he hasn't been the worst player in the world. If anything, he's shown that he could be a solid rotational player in a good defensive line, as long as he isn't tasked with playing the run too often. But relative to expectations, Ferrell hasn't lived up to the status of the 4th overall pick, or even the 15th overall pick. But someone's gotta win. So we give this point to consensus, ending this video with a final score of 10-3 in favor of consensus. And with that, we've now revisited the biggest reaches of the 2019 NFL Draft. If you haven't seen my last video going over the biggest consensus draft steals or biggest fallers, make sure to check it out. In total for the 2019 draft, consensus takes the win with a score of 14-11. But there's definitely a few close calls that may change in a few years once we revisit again. Maybe you don't even agree on my scoring for this year, so let me know below. Otherwise, I'll be doing this exact same type of video for multiple past draft classes and ones in the future, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out. Also, I put a ton of research and time into these videos, so I'd really appreciate a like and subscribe. Which NFL draft class should I cover next? Let me know in the comments below. But that's enough for today, fellas. Later.